In the third installment of the RADNUC web series, we'll be looking at the second half, or back end, of the nuclear fuel cycle. There was perhaps no better expert to have on board for this episode then than Professor Neil Hyatt, Chief Scientific Advisor at Nuclear Waste Services. Nuclear Waste Services is the organisation focused on the management of nuclear waste in the UK and the development of a UK geological disposal facility. In his capacity as Chief Scientific Advisor, Neil is involved in a multitude of technical areas within the Nuclear Waste Services, advising on everything from geology and environment to waste package design and engineering. Prior to joining Nuclear Waste Services, Neil served in his academic career as a Professor of Nuclear Materials Chemistry at the University of Sheffield, and recently commenced his role at the University of Bristol as Aegis Professor of Deep Time Science and Engineering. In this episode, Neil discusses what radioactive waste is, how we classify radioactive waste, what happens to spent fuel after it leaves a nuclear reactor, and the UK project on developing a geological disposal facility. Good morning, Neil.
Morning, Ishi.
How are you?
I'm very well. And yourself?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for joining us for episode 3 of the web series. As usual with these, we're going to start broad with our questions and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. So my first question, very broad. What is nuclear waste and how is it categorized?
Very good. So nuclear waste primarily comes from the production of nuclear power. So it's the process of generation of electricity in nuclear power stations, generally from uranium as the fuel. There are other sources of nuclear waste. So, for example, from medicine, from research, in the UK from the nuclear defence programme and elsewhere. But all of this waste has the property of being radioactive. And it's that hazard that we need to control to protect people and the environment. That's what kind of makes it interesting and also sometimes challenging. So yeah, in the UK then we have categories of radioactive waste: high-level waste, intermediate level waste, and low-level waste. So low-level waste is defined as 4 gigabecquerels per tonne alpha or 12 gigabecquerels per tonne beta gamma radioactivity or below. Okay, and above that threshold we have either intermediate level waste or high level waste. And the differentiation between those two is that intermediate level waste, there's not a need to manage the heat output of the waste during storage or disposal. And for high level waste, that heat output needs to be considered in the design of the store or the disposal facility.
Okay, so when we look at intermediate level waste and high level waste, we're looking at approximately similar levels of radioactivity, just differences in heat generation.
So generally, the nature of high level waste tends to mean that the amount of radioactivity and the hazard posed for the radioactivity is much greater. And as a consequence of having that greater radioactivity, you have a greater heat output. So those things sort of do go together. So there's not a sort of differentiation between them in terms of activity per unit weight or volume. So there's not sort of any sort of sharp crossover. It's that aspect of needing to manage the heat output in the design of a storage or disposal facility, which effectively is the differentiation.
Right, okay. So anything high-level waste is going to be the stuff that contains fuel material. When we're talking about intermediate level waste, that doesn't actually contain spent fuel.
Right, yeah. So spent fuel itself is kind of needs a bit of special consideration. So nuclear fuel, when it comes out of a reactor and is no longer economic for electricity generation, that remains the liability and the property of the owner. And the owner then needs to decide what to do with it. So it could either choose to recycle the fuel, or it could choose to dispose of the fuel. And it doesn't become waste until that decision is taken. So for the amount of spent nuclear fuel that we plan to dispose of in the geological disposal facility, so we have to make a plan to dispose of it, that's not actually yet declared as waste. So it's what we call a nuclear material. And it's only when that sort of sentencing as a waste happens that it actually carries the label as a waste. So nevertheless, spent nuclear fuel will have heat generation that does need to be taken account in terms of both storage and disposal. And so high-level waste effectively at the current time is reserved for the glass material, which contains the products, the radioactive products of nuclear fission, which are extracted from the fuel by what's called fuel reprocessing or fuel recycle. And so that radioactive material, what we call the fission products, minor actinides, that's immobilized in the glass material, and that becomes high-level waste. And there is a small amount of fuel, spent nuclear fuel, which is considered as a waste, and that will also be heat generating and come in that category. So that's where we are with that.
Brilliant. And you touched on something I was going to ask next, actually. So when we talk about reprocessing, what is the difference between an open and a closed fuel cycle? What do we mean by open and closed?
Right. Okay. So if you took so let's back up for a second. So difference between open and closed fuel cycle depends on the fate of the nuclear fuel once it's removed from the reactor, because it's no longer efficient and economic for electricity generation. Now that fuel still has some useful energy generating capacity. So for example, when we're looking at sort of conventional nuclear reactors of the kind that we operate in this country, the fissile nuclide, what we break apart to release atomic energy, is an isotope called uranium-235. And there will still be some residual uranium-235 in the fuel when it's removed from the reactor. There'll also be some plutonium, which is produced by capture of neutrons from a different isotope of uranium, uranium-238. And there's still plenty of uranium-238. So all of that stuff still has the potential to generate energy in the future. And so you have to take a decision as to whether you're going to extract that from the fuel for reuse, which is a closed fuel cycle, or you will accept the disposal of that potential energy vector as a waste in due course, and that would be an open fuel cycle. So, for example, Finland operates a closed fuel cycle, so it chooses to dispose of its spent nuclear fuel as waste. France operates essentially a true closed fuel cycle, and it extracts uranium plutonium from its spent nuclear fuel to refabricate into new fuel, mixed oxide fuel, to go back into reactors. So that's the kind of difference.
Okay. And what's the UK policy currently? Do we operate open or closed?
So effectively, we now have an open fuel cycle because we no longer have any active reprocessing capability. So the RADNUC fuel reprocessing facility closed this year after more than 50 years of operation. And so, it's no longer possible to reprocess fuel in the UK. And so by default, we have an open fuel cycle.
Okay, brilliant. And with that open fuel cycle, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but in detail, we've got your nuclear fuel in the reactor and it's no longer economically viable. What immediately happens to that nuclear fuel?
Right. So when the fuel is removed from the reactor, the at the atomic scale, when we've broken apart uranium or plutonium atoms into two pieces, and that releases energy, which is converted to electricity through the nuclear reactor and so on. The products, the fission products, these two sort of pieces of the original uranium atom, they form different elements in the periodic table. So, and it doesn't exactly split into two equal parts. They're kind of like slightly unequal in mass, but they have basically half the mass of the uranium atom. Well, in the periodic table, stable elements are determined by the ratio of neutrons to protons. And the ratio of neutron to protons of these two pieces of the uranium atom is wrong for the mass number in the periodic table. There are too many neutrons. So those neutrons start converting into protons, and that's the process of radioactive decay we call beta decay. Because there are quite an excess of neutrons, that process is energetic and initially occurs quite rapidly, and so that's a way of saying that the radioactivity in that nuclear fuel is very intense, and that radioactivity, the decay, the energy released by radioactive decay gets converted to heat, and so you need to manage that heat, right? So as we've discussed. So that's kind of a long way of saying, or giving an explanation to the fact that when the spent nuclear fuel comes out of the reactor, it will need to be cooled, typically in a sort of in a storage pond. We use water for cooling and for shielding of the spent nuclear fuel to cut down the gamma dose rate. And it might be stored there for, let's say, a period of 10 years before it might be repackaged or taken out to dry storage or something like that. But it needs to be actively cooled to remove the decay heat and obviously to shield people in the environment from the radioactivity.
So before we move on to the next step, I mean, obviously there's currently no direct route to disposal ready here in the UK. But before we go on to GDF, what are some of the historic disposal concepts that people came up with in the past?
Oh, crumbs. So we should mention also the low-level waste repository near Drigg, which accommodates the disposal of low-level waste today and has done for decades. And we also have a route for very low-level waste, which is a sort of subcategory of LLW, which is very lightly contaminated material that might go out to licensed landfill, for example. So we do have some routes available to us, and also treatment rules like recycle of metal and so on. But yeah, so before we go into GDF, I think what other schemes have been considered, and so they are things like putting it into rockets and firing it into space or into the sun, or disposal in the seabed, in deep sea sediments, disposal in polar ice caps, disposal in volcanoes. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole range of ideas that have been proposed, but they all have essentially unacceptable risks. And that's why the international consensus is that disposal of radioactive waste, higher activity radioactive waste in a deep geological formation is the best way to make the waste permanently safe sooner. So that's the safest way to finally bring that waste to an end point in its management.
And can you walk us through the general concept of a GDF? What does a GDF look like, and what is the concept of geological disposal?
Right, so geological disposal is the disposal of radioactive waste, and in the UK that will be at a depth between 200 to 1,000 meters in a stable geological environment. And the facility itself will consist of excavated tunnels and vaults underground with an access way. And the radioactive waste, according to the nature of the radioactive waste, will either be sort of stacked in vaults or it will be placed in tunnels and surrounded by a material like a cement or a clay to stabilize and protect the waste package, potentially to chemically condition the incoming groundwater. And eventually the facility will be sealed. It will be closed, and that will be involve sealing the access ways and backfilling the tunnels and vaults and so on. And the kind of safety principle of the facility is that it will remain safe without human intervention. So it has to evolve according to sort of the principle of passive safety. No active measures can be taken to assure the safety. And the reason that that's the case is because although we currently store radioactive waste at more than 20 sites around the UK, safely and securely, that is not necessarily a long-term sustainable solution. So if you look at the conflict in Ukraine, for example, where Zaporizhzhia has been on the front line, and Chernobyl, was a site of of conflict as well, that's put radioactive waste storage facilities in a very vulnerable position where there could have been an environmental disaster had containment of that material been lost. So although we do currently practice above ground storage safely and securely, for the longer term, the lowest risk, the safest solution is to bring that material underground, to isolate it from the surface and contain the radioactivity.
Okay, and where are we up to in the UK with this process? What does the process look like of developing a GDF here?
Right, so we are still at an early stage. So we are talking to 4 potential communities that could, in the future, host the development of the geological disposal facility. So nothing's been decided yet. They're at the second stage of our process called community partnership. And government policy requires us to site a GDF where we have a willing community with a suitable geology. And those two things have to go together. We can't have a willing community with a geology that's not adequate. And likewise, we can't just go over after what we think to be a suitable geology without having a willing community. Those two things are inextricably linked. And there is a protection for the potential host community in terms of a test of public support. So in the future, before we take a decision to go forward with siting and select a site, the host community has to take a positive test of public support to decide that that's right for them and they're comfortable with it and it's part of their community vision. So we're currently talking to 3 communities in Cumberland, so in the areas of Copeland and Allerdale, and then 1 community on the east coast and on the Lincolnshire coast around the area of Thedlethorpe. And in all 4 of those potential host communities, we're interested in the development of a GDF under the sea but accessed from land, what we call an inshore environment. And the target rock type that we're looking at is a lower strength sedimentary rock in each case. So on the west coast, it's like a mudstone, and on the east coast, it's essentially a claystone rock. So we're currently at the stage of really trying to understand subsurface geology in more detail, to understand its suitability, to understand things like what the transport implications might be, but also to develop, trust and a relationship with the potential host community, and to answer their questions and to provide them with the information they need to understand whether this would be part of their vision, and to enable them to make an intelligent decision for themselves, their community, and their families, and so on. So that's where we are today, and that process probably has another sort of 10 to 15 years to run. At some point, there may or may not be a decision to go forward with investigative boreholes of the subsurface to get information on the geology at the location, test of public support, and then eventually, when a site is selected, we would think maybe 10 years of construction, let's say, and then maybe 120 years of operation to get the waste in place. So that's the sort of forward look. So sitting here going forward, we're talking about maybe 150 years for that project to complete. So I certainly won't be around when that finishes. As interesting as it is as a subject and as a job and as a project to be involved in, but our focus every day is on safety and ensuring that we've got safety today and into the future.
Fantastic. It's a massive infrastructure project, and I mean it goes to show if you're looking for a career in nuclear waste management, you've got at least 150 years ahead of you.
Right, yeah, and we will need people at all skill levels, from apprenticeships right up to PhDs and subject matter experts into the future. There's a huge amount that we need to do in terms of the design, and that work will begin to sort of ramp up rapidly as we learn more about the site and what it means for the layout and the design and so on. We need all the surrounding kind of capability. So, finance, project management, legal expertise, environmental surveys, HR. It's a big infrastructure project. Wide cross section of careers at different levels. And I think 4,000 jobs to be created by the project itself in the first 25 years alone. And then, benefits into the local area in terms of enterprise and drawing on the local supply chain and so on. So yeah, it's an opportunity. I tell you what attracted me into this role was the opportunity to help lead a project, see science applied to assure safety, and the opportunity to make a real positive difference to communities through being a big infrastructure project. And we're privileged to be in that position.
Wonderful. Yeah, you beat me to the catch, because I was going to say, while we're talking about careers, what's your favourite aspect of your job? But that's wonderful.
Crumbs. Well, it's so I'm chief scientific advisor, and so my role is really to make sure we're doing, or in part it's to make sure we're doing the right science at the right time in the right way to the right standards, that we're using it as evidence in the right way to underpin our decision making and so on. So that's part of my role, and I see a huge cross section of science in that capacity. So everything from the atomic scale, so the binding of radionuclides to surfaces, and then it will be wells on containers at the other end of the scale potentially. So, and everything in between, and a bit more at the top end as well. So you see a huge range of science and engineering, which is really interesting, and you get into the detail of it all, but then it all has to be used for a purpose, and so making sure that we do that in the right way is a real privilege. So it's a great role to be in.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Neil. I've learned a lot. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.